Hey everybody, welcome back to our Ravnica Allegiance set review. This is Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and this is part 4, where we'll be looking at Orzhov, the grindy guild of the set. We've already looked at a control deck, we've looked at the beatdown deck, we've looked at the hyper aggro deck. This time we're going to look at Orzhov, which has Afterlife. Afterlife lends itself to a pretty grindy game pattern. And the way Afterlife works is it'll have a number associated with it, and when a creature with Afterlife dies, you create a number of 1/1 white and black spirits with flying equal to the number. And I believe Afterlife ranges anywhere from 1 on most cards to 3. I might be wrong, there might be something higher than 3, but I believe Afterlife 3 is the highest it goes on some of the more expensive and higher rarity cards. But since most creatures in your deck will replace themselves with spirits, you lend yourselves to kind of a little bit more of a defensive archetype here. I'm sure you can play aggro, but Afterlife is going to play a little bit better with mass board pumps and sacrifice effects than some of the other guilds will. So let's go ahead and get started here with our sideboard cards, the ones we're not super excited about, but the ones that have some potential out of the sideboard, starting with our Planeswalker. It's kind of weird to see a sideboard Planeswalker, but Kaya, Orzhov Usurper, is nonetheless kind of just a sideboard card here. She's 1 white-black for a mythic, Kaya Planeswalker, obviously, 3 loyalty. Her +1 exiles 2 cards from a single graveyard, and you gain 2 life if you exiled a creature this way. Her -1 exiles any non-land permanent with converted mana cost 1 or less. In this case, I don't think there are any 0 drops in the set, so just 1, or I guess tokens as well. And then her -5 deals damage to target player equal to how many cards they own in exile, and you gain that much life. So primarily her +1 is graveyard hate, and there's a couple cards in this set that hate on graveyards, and I'm not entirely sure why, because there aren't really that many cards that use the graveyard. None of the guilds are really using their graveyard especially well, so Kaya is not really even here for limited purposes. She's the cool kind of card that, like, when you open her, you'll probably take her because she'll be worth at least a little bit of money, but she doesn't really do anything. At best, her -1 might be able to snipe your opponent's 1-drop, but even then I would keep Kaya in the sideboard until I see that my opponent is playing a bunch of 1-drops, and she doesn't really interact much else. There's also not that many exile effects floating around, so it's not too easy to dome the opponent for a large amount with the -5, but if you are in an extremely controlling deck, and the game is going to go for a very long time, I could see a kind of pattern where you +++ and then -5 for a big chunk of damage. Plus, you keep yourself alive while doing it, since she gains 2 life with the +1. But for the most part, this is not a limited card. It's hardly even a constructed card, and it's a little weird that it doesn't do anything particularly well with Afterlife. But this is the Planeswalker we get, not necessarily the one we deserve, and I would suggest probably not playing it at all. Thankfully, that's the only real sideboard card here, or really the only unplayable card we have in Orzhov. The next couple ones we're going to see kind of a trend, but we're going to start off with our split card or our hybrid card. This Scope of Vampire is 2 and a white-black hybrid mana for a 3/1 lifelinker. It's a common vampire. So you're paying 3 mana total for a 3/1, and honestly, I think even with lifelink, this is a little bit worse than something like Child of Night, which is already a card I dislike quite a bit. 3/1s for 2 are not very good, especially in a format where there are going to be 1/1 spirits floating around, no pun intended, and paying 1 extra mana for 1 more power but not pumping the toughness doesn't really appeal to me. Lifelink is nice, however, against the Gruul and the Rakdos decks, which are going to be looking to attack your life total early and often. So at the very least, this is a card you can put in your deck and it'll trade off and gain you some life, but don't expect it to be too much better than just a filler card. Debtor's Transport, and we'll see a couple of these kind of overcosted Afterlife creatures that are still decent. Also, this is kind of weird looking, makes me uncomfortable, but Debtor's Transport is a 5 and a black, 6 mana total for a 5/3 common Thrall with Afterlife 2. Pretty simple, right? 5 mana 5/3 wouldn't even be that good, and 6 mana 5/3 is particularly bad, but Afterlife 2 does carry this from unplayable into low pick playable. I'm not very excited by the card. It is nice that this can trade off with a really big creature and then leave behind an actual reasonable board presence with Afterlife 2, but for the most part, I think you're going to be doing better than this card in most of your Orzhov decks. The same goes for Knight of Sorrows. She is 4 and a white for a 3/3 common human knight. She can block an additional creature each combat, and she has Afterlife 1. So similar to the Debtor's Transport, you have an overcosted creature. 5 mana 3/3 is not very good in this format, or most formats, and even though she can block an extra creature, I never seem to see that type of text come up very often. She can be a last-ditch effort against a beatdown deck and buy you some time, plus she'll replace herself with a spirit, so if you are playing a very grindy game and you're looking for sacrifice fodder or ways to just make sure that you stay alive, then you can play these last two cards here, but I don't think they'll ever be very exceptional in your deck. Twilight Panther is next. This is the activated ability cycle card of the set. It's a single white for a 1/2. It's a cat spirit common, and it has black, gains death touch until end of turn. So another death toucher in the set. This one's a little bit awkward because unlike most of the cycle, this really only fits in Orzhov. You do not want to play this in any other white decks. I don't think Azorius wants this card unless you're already splashing black for something else. And overall, this card's never going to be that much better than how it looks on its face, right? It's going to be the type of card that keeps you alive when it comes to facing down the beatdown decks. Maybe Simic or Gruul have a tough time getting through these death touch creatures, but it's never going to be exceptional. And that brings us into our next category, the medium power level cards. So we're moving away from those cards that aren't particularly good, and these are the cards that you're actually happy with when they make the deck. Starting with Knight of the Last Breath. 5 white, black, 7 mana total for a 4/4. Yeah, it's a little skeptical right there. 7 mana 4/4 is very below the curve. It's an uncommon, it's a giant knight, and it has an activated ability for 3 mana. You can sack another creature, and you create 1/1 white, black spirit token with flying. So sack a creature for 3 mana, make a 1/1. This can present a sort of chain, right? You block with a token. That's not true. 3, 2, 1. Note that you can't necessarily chain this together, right? You can't block with a token and then sacrifice it to make another token because you can only sacrifice non-token creatures. But if you end up with any sort of effect that lets you steal your opponent's creature, or if they slap kind of a Luminous Bonds type effect on your creature, this is a decent way to make sure you're getting value off of everything. It essentially gives something Afterlife 1 and then sacrifices it. The giant itself also has Afterlife 3, which I believe is the highest number Afterlife card in the set, but it's still a little bit dicey, right? You have to survive to get to the point where you can play a 7 mana spell anyway. Plus it's a 4/4, so it might just die to some removal spell before you really get to use it, and you have to have creatures that you're willing to sacrifice. This asks quite a bit, but if your opponent does deal with it, at least you leave behind 3 spirits, and I think the Afterlife 3 is what pushes this up to a medium power level card rather than a low power level card. The effect itself is not super impressive on a 7-drop, and the stat line's a little bit weak compared to some of the other guilds. I think we have to see how aggressive this format really is before we can determine how good 6 and 7 drop creatures are. So you'll notice I'm rating a lot of these expensive cards in the either medium power level or low power level categories for that reason. Syndicate Guild Mages next. Probably one of the worst Guild Mages in the set, but all Guild Mages are playable. It's white-black for a 2/2 uncommon human cleric. The first ability is 1 and a white to tap it and tap a creature with power 4 or greater. So this is going to be really good against some decks and pretty terrible against other decks. You'll notice in particular, Orzhov doesn't have a lot of high power creatures, and Rakdos doesn't have a lot of high power creatures. So the Guild Mage is going to vary in its first ability's effectiveness depending on what deck you're playing against. The second ability is 4 and a black, tap it. Deals 2 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. So you've got kind of a last-ditch, kind of consistent way to dump your mana and deal damage to the opponent. This doesn't matter as much in Orzhov as it will for, say, Rakdos, and the Rakdos Guild Mage already did a pretty good job at dealing damage to the opponent for way less mana. I believe it was a single red to deal 1, rather than 5 mana to deal 5. But if you're playing a grindy game, you're looking to stall the game out with your Afterlife creatures and your tokens, then I could see the Syndicate Guild Mage being your consistent source of damage. It's a lot like the Legion Guild Mage, but a little bit worse in Orzhov than that creature was in Boros, since Boros wants to be killing your opponent quickly, and that 3 damage from the Guild Mage mattered a lot. I don't know how much attacking your opponent's life total is going to be. I feel like Orzhov is going to play a very long game and look for incremental advantages. So I'm not sure how good this Guild Mage fits into its guild yet, but it seems decent to me, if not super powerful. Syndicate Messenger is next, 3 and a white for a 2/3 flyer with Afterlife 1. You'll notice all these kind of dorky middle-of-the-ground creatures with like Afterlife 1 are all kind of medium power level, right? This card's never going to be that great, and cards like it are never going to be insane, but they do present a reasonable body that leaves behind something when they die. So all of these Afterlife creatures are mini 2-for-1s or little 1.5-for-1s, if you will. Anytime your Afterlife creature gets to trade off for an opponent's creature, you're probably going to feel fine, and I think the Syndicate Messenger will do that quite often. Grasp and Throw is next, 3 white-black for a 3/3 common flyer. When it enters the battlefield, deals 2 damage to each opponent, and you gain 2 life. I have noticed in my review that there are a lot of 5-mana 3/3 flyers, or at least 3 power, 3 toughness flyers throughout this format, so there are going to be a lot of fights in the air. Also, Orzhov and Azorius in particular are going to be winning the game through flyers more often than not, so Grasp and Throw is a nice addition to that strategy, plus the enter the battlefield trigger is decent. It basically negates an attack from an early drop later on in the game, gains you some life, goes a little ways towards dealing damage to the opponent, and leaves behind a real threat on board. So I think it's a good card, if not, again, a super powerful card. Imperious Oligarch is next, white-black for a 2/1 with Vigilance and Afterlife 1. Vigilance is not super exciting, but I have noticed with 2 power, 2-mana Vigilance creatures, your opponent is often incentivized to trade off as early as possible, since if they don't block your 2/2 or your 2-power creature with their 2-drop, then you're getting in free damage and you still have the block available to you. So a lot of times this will trade off, leave you behind a Spirit, and I think that's fine. I can repeat this into oblivion, but anytime you have an Afterlife creature that trades off for a reasonably sized or equal mana cost creature, if you get a fair trade and you leave behind a Spirit, you're going to be pretty happy with that. Next up is Tithe Taker, which is very similar to the Imperious Oligarch, but it's a rare with some added text to it. It's 1 and a white for a 2/1 with Afterlife 1, and during your turn, your opponent's spells and activated abilities cost 1 more to activate, as long as they're not mana abilities. So same kind of design as far as power and toughness go for the Oligarch, but a little bit easier to cast, which means this is a card you could be happily putting in your Azorius deck, not just your Orzhov deck. Anytime your 2-power creatures have Afterlife anything, I think that's going to be a decent card. And like I mentioned in some of the other videos, there are just a ton of bears floating around this format. So having a 2-power creature that can trade off for your opponent's 2-drop and leave behind something relevant seems good to me. I don't think the trinket text will come up too often, but it will be a little bit annoying for Azorius decks to play against, since they are very instant-based and want to play a lot of stuff on their opponent's turn. Orzhov Racketeers is up next, and I like the design of this card, but I'm not sure how good it is yet. It's 4 and a black for a 3/2. It's an uncommon human rogue, and when it deals damage to a player, that player discards a card, and it has Afterlife 2. So you get kind of the joke of the design here, right? Your opponent is incentivized to block it because they don't want to discard cards if it connects, but if they do block and kill it, you get 2 spirits. So either way, you're up something, right? Now, this is the type of card that gets a lot more awkward if your opponent has, say, a 4/4 or something like that, where, yeah, you could jam in and get your 2 spirits, and that's fine, but you're not getting a huge advantage off of that. If this creature never makes your opponent lose a card, never makes him discard, and doesn't trade off for a creature, then Afterlife 2 isn't really justifying the 5 mana you spent on it. But if you can at minimum trade this off, then 2 spirits is the real deal. And if you can get this creature in there, making your opponent discard feels good too. Orzhov Enforcer is a card I love. It's 1 and a black for a 1/2 uncommon human rogue with, you guessed it, Death Touch and Afterlife 1. Now, I love already a 2-mana 1/2 Death Touch. I'd be playing that pretty much all day in this format, especially since the ground-based decks are going to have a tough time dealing with Death Touch. But adding Afterlife to a Typhoid Rats or to a Hired Poisoner seems really good to me, right? Your opponent's going to have to trade off for this at some point or use a removal spell on it. And either way, you're going to be left with a 1/1 Spirit. You only pay 2 mana for the card, so your opponent's got to make the choice of when to pop it. But it's going to sit back and annoy your opponent until that happens, and you're going to get rewarded for it. Oftentimes, I think the Enforcer is going to trade up on mana and leave behind a Spirit, and that justifies its uncommon rarity here. Our Orzhov uncommon split card here is a little bit weaker than some of the others, mostly because Consecrate's not that great. It's 1 and an Orzhov hybrid mana, so 2 mana total for an instant, and it exiles a card from a graveyard, and you draw a card. It doesn't really do that much. Like I said with Kaya, there's not a lot of incentive to be exiling your opponent's cards out of their graveyard, since there aren't any archetypes or guilds that really use their graveyard as a resource here. At the very worst, it cantrips, though. And honestly, you could do better than a 2 mana cycler. Consume is the good half here. It's 2 white and a black for a sorcery. Target player sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among all of the creatures they control, and you gain life equal to its power. So I'm not normally a big fan of these edict effects. Making your opponent sacrifice a creature normally means that they're going to sack whatever the worst is, and unless you can time it or they have just a single creature on board, they might just sacrifice some dorky creature that's not relevant anymore. Consume kind of gets around that a little bit by making sure that your opponent is sacrificing their biggest creature, but some decks aren't going to have that many big creatures. I imagine Consume is going to play well against the green decks since they'll often have big creatures, and the life gain is going to be good too, but even the biggest creature might not be the biggest threat sometimes, so be careful how you play this card and understand that it's not premium removal. And out of that territory into the high power level cards, these are the ones I'm getting a little bit excited about, starting off with Teysa Karlov, 2 white and a black for a 2/4 rare legendary human advisor. Hey, it's an advisor for Advisor Tribal. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So your permanents trigger, but it counts anytime any creature on board dies. So for some reason, your opponent's creature dies, and that causes one of your permanents to trigger, you get to double up on that. Clearly, that's here for Afterlife, right? It basically doubles up on your Afterlife, which to me seems amazing. The second part says, creature tokens you control have vigilance and lifelink. These are almost always going to be your spirit tokens, but sometimes you'll be playing some weird 3 or 4 color amalgamation where other tokens will suddenly have vigilance and lifelink, and that to me seems like a lot of potential for Teysa. Now, the reason I give her the high power level pick and not the bomb pick is because you do have to support her, right? Without tokens or death triggers, she's a 4 mana 2/4, which is not exactly something to write home about. However, once you start piling up maybe 5 to 6 Afterlife cards, she becomes an actively strong card, and your opponent's going to have to deal with Teysa before she deals with your other creatures. And that 4 toughness does keep her alive through a lot of the burn spells and removal spells in the format. So I think Teysa is going to be very good when she's good, but there are going to be times that she's a blank, and even though I do think she's probably first pick territory since you can build around her, you do have to understand that she's not super impressive, and there are some times where she's not really going to do anything out of the ordinary. Basilica Bellhaunt is our CCDD card, white, white, black, black for a 3/4 uncommon spirit. When it enters battlefield, each opponent discards a card and you gain 3 life. I've had a lot of people look at this card and say, it doesn't seem that good, it's not busted compared to the rest of the cycle. And yeah, it's not busted, but it's ultimately super fair, and it has a good combination of abilities. At the very worst, it's a 2-for-1. It's a 3/4 for 4, which is already a card that I'm a little bit interested in. It makes your opponent discard a card no matter what, which we've seen some commons that do that, but you have to put in extra work for them, and it gains you a little bit of life. So, like I said, Orzhov is buying time. It's being grindy. It's looking to play this really late game. Basilica Bellhaunt seems like the perfect card to fit into that strategy, if you ask me. Final Payment is one of the better removal spells in the format. It's white and a black for a common instant. As an additional cost to cast the spell, you may pay 5 life, or sack a creature or enchantment. And the effect is pretty simple, destroy target creature. So this is as unconditional as removal gets in this format, and I believe this is the cheapest way to just straight up kill a creature in this format, no questions asked. The upside, or rather the additional cost, I should say, is a real cost, though, since a lot of times you'll be paying 5 life, and that's 25% of your starting life total. But there are cards in Orzhov that gain you life, there are life linkers, and sometimes you'll just sacrifice a creature, maybe even for value, and sometimes you'll sacrifice an enchantment that's not really doing much. So, even though the payment options to cast this are a little bit hefty, there's enough options that you should be able to turn it into an advantage, or at least not that much of a downside, and the upside of killing basically anything is nice. This is the type of card, though, that you probably don't want to have a whole play set of them in your deck. You probably want to make sure that you can support 1 or 2 of them, and it'll play out like Dismember most of the time, where you're paying a chunk of life to kill a creature, but hey, in my opinion, that's pretty good. Mortify is back, and Mortify is, like a lot of other cards like Bedevil and some of the other removal we've mentioned in this set, it's about as close as a first pickable removal spell as you can get, right? The reason it's not a bomb or a first pick category card is because it is 2 colors and it pushes you a little bit, but it's fairly splashable, it's unconditional, and I love that it destroys an enchantment here. I've mentioned in other videos, there are tons of enchantments floating around this set, and having answers to them seems ideal. Mortify is one such answer for a color that might not otherwise have answers to enchantments. For example, black doesn't get enchantment removal, and white only has maybe 1 or 2 other ways to deal with enchantments, but most of the time this is going to be a 3-mana murder to kill a creature, and that's just fine. Pitiless Pontiff is next, white to black for a 2/2 uncommon vampire cleric. You may pay 1 and sack another creature to give the Pontiff Death Touch, ding ding, Death Touch again, and indestructible until end of turn. So when you boil it down, what happens is your opponent has to be careful how they attack into you and how they block if the Pontiff comes in. If they do block, or you get to block with the Pontiff, basically you get to trade off the creature you're most willing to have dead for your opponent's best creature, or whatever their best attacker or blocker is, right? In other words, you get to sacrifice a creature to destroy a creature. At least that's how it boils down when it comes to this creature blocking. That's not exactly what it does, but that's how it's going to play out. Basically, you almost grant Death Touch to whatever creature you want. Pitiless Pontiff is going to be very hard to kill. It gives you a sacrifice outlet as well, which is going to be pretty good with a lot of it. A lot of Orzhov's mechanics and a lot of Orzhov's play. And it's probably a good time to mention that Mardu is probably going to be something that crops up in this format from time to time, since there are about 2 to 3 ways to steal opponents' creatures, making Pitiless Pontiff a really sweet card in that sort of shell. I'm thinking cards like Active Treason and some of the red cards that steal your opponent's creatures for the turn. So I do think Pitiless Pontiff is going to be the type of card that if you're playing a green deck and you're facing it down, you're going to struggle to get rid of it. It can also blank removal spells like Mortify by just sacrificing a creature. So be careful how you play against this card. It's going to be a nightmare, but you're going to have to deal with it eventually, or it's just going to brick wall the ground for you. Ministrant of Obligation. All right, this card looks unassuming, but I think it's really strong. It's 2 and a white for a 2/1, and it has Afterlife too. That means you get a 3-mana 2/1, which is very below the curve, but that's still going to be enough to trade off for most of your opponent's 2-drops, and also some of the 3/2s in the format, and heck, there are even 4/2s in the format too. And what you leave behind is 2 1/1 spirits. Afterlife 2 seems to be reserved for some of the more expensive cards, and this is about as cheap as you can get for a creature that has Afterlife 2. And Afterlife 2, it's kind of dorky to say it, right? But that's way better than Afterlife 1. Basically, you trade off 2 power for 2 more power, and your opponent's got to kill this across 3 bodies in order to completely deal with it. So I think uncommon on a 3-mana 2/1 looks weird, but I think the combination of effects that you get here and the combination of the 3 different bodies that you'll get definitely means this is a pretty good card. Our rare here for the split cards in Orzhov is Revival and Revenge. Revival is 2 white-black hybrid mana to return a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield at sorcery speed. 2 mana for a 3-drop is pretty good, 2 mana for a 2-drop is fine, and anything else is just fine as well. Revival is going to play out just fine. It's never going to be broken, but if you get back an Afterlife creature, you're going to get another spirit at some point. You probably already got the spirit off the creature at some point anyway, since it died, and I think that's just a lot of card advantage over the course of the game for 2 mana. So I think you'll be happy with Revival, even if sometimes you'll pass it up for some of the stronger uncommons. The second half is Revenge, 4 white black for a sorcery, 6 mana sorcery. You double your life total, and your opponent loses half of their life total rounded up. This is going to be a nightmare for some decks to play against. If you're playing Rakdos and you're playing against somebody with Revenge in their deck and you just haven't been able to push in the damage, maybe you got them down to 10 life, maybe you got them down to like 12, and they cast Revenge, suddenly you're at 10 or maybe less, maybe a little bit more, but you lose half your life total, and they're at such a high life total that you're probably not going to be able to kill them. There are other times where you're beating down the opponent who has Revenge. You get them down to, say, 2 to 4 life, and you just need to finish them off, and the Revenge starts to look a little bit weak. It only gains them 4 life or something. So the effect of Revenge is going to vary from game to game and depend on how aggressive your opponent is and how much damage they've done up to that point. But I think since Revival is here to kind of save it, Revenge is sometimes going to be your finisher or your linchpin card against certain strategies, but Revival, for the most part, is going to be the card that you're trying to cast. And our bombs, the strongest Orzhov cards in the set, starting with Seraph of the Scales, Mythic Rare. It is 2 white-black for a 4/3 flyer, and it has 2 activated abilities. For white, it gains Vigilance, and for black, it gains, hey look, Death Touch. And it has Afterlife too. So Death Touch on a big flyer is a little bit weird, right? All it means is that your opponent can't block this with basically anything, and you can block anything that comes into this, and it'll trade off basically no matter what. Given this, Vigilance is kind of a little bit weird too, since there aren't a lot of flyers that can trade off, but as I've mentioned, there's a good number of 3-power flyers, and if those trade off with Seraph of the Scales, you have Afterlife 2 to kind of bring it back. Seraph is not a busted mythic rare, as we've seen in some of the other videos, namely the 2 Gruul mythics, the Dragon and the Ravager Worm, or the Spawn of Mayhem. Those are busted mythics. Seraph of the Scales feels like a good value mythic and just a strong card, and I'd be happy to first pick it. It's going to trade off with basically anything you want. It's hard to remove without triggering Afterlife 2, and as with all the other Afterlife cards we've seen so far, you're getting value no matter what happens. Death Touch, Vigilance are a little bit of throwaways on a big flyer against some decks, but they'll work when they work, and they'll be happy when they do. Ethereal Absolution seems very strong to me. It's 4 white-black for a rare enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1, and your opponent's creatures get -1/-1. If that's all it did, you'd probably win the game off of just that. You're going to have a couple spirits and a couple creatures floating around when this comes down, and this anthems all of them while simultaneously shrinking all of your opponent's creatures. So your spirits are probably likely going to trade off with literally anything your opponent has at that point, and if you have any sort of board presence when you play this card, you might just win the game out of nowhere. The activated ability is 2 white and a black to exile a card from an opponent's graveyard, and if it was a creature, you basically Afterlife 1, you create a 1/1 black and white spirit creature token with flying, which in the case of Ethereal Absolution will actually be a 2/2. This is less graveyard hate for the format and more just a way to kind of generate tokens and build up a board. Basically, if you have any sort of board when your opponent, or rather when you play this, it's going to be very good. And if your opponent has any relevant board, it's going to get much worse for them. I don't imagine you'll lose too many games where you get to resolve this card, and I do think it is bomb territory as far as enchantments go, but you got to be careful. There are a few ways, just a few, to deal with enchantments, and if you swing the wrong attack into your opponent and they have a way to bump this off board, that could alter the way the board looks, and you could be in a lot of trouble. But for the most part, this will come down, nuke the board. Even though it might not remove creatures right away, it'll make it very difficult for your opponent to win. Kaya's Wrath is next. This is white, white, black, black. A little interesting to see another white, white, black, black card, but it's a good one. It's a rare sorcery, destroys all creatures, and you gain life for each creature that you controlled that was destroyed by Kaya's Wrath. So 4 mana Wrath, not something we see. Even though it's mana intensive, I really love having reset buttons in my deck, and I think you should be first picking Kaya's Wrath when you see it. I also like that the mana cost is restrictive enough that you can't really splash it in other decks without a bunch of gates. So if you're playing against Azorius, you don't really have to think about Kaya's Wrath unless they start playing black lands, right? Kaya's Wrath is very good, and even if you're in a position where you don't have to Wrath, having the reset button, having the option to do it will get you out of some situations that no other card will. I always like having a Wrath in my deck if I can, Not necessarily the biggest fan of playing against them, but you can play around it and you can play around your own Wraths. So I suggest first picking Kai's Wrath, having it as an option even if you don't need it, and playing it when it's going to be good. And that covers up Orzhov. So you kind of see what they were going for. Very grindy games, a little bit of recursion, but all of your creatures dying into spirits is kind of the name of the game. None of the cards are super overwhelmingly powerful. I think the 6-mana enchantment is probably Orzhov's best card, but I think the course of the game, if you can trade off creatures and you can turn them into spirit tokens, that you'll be doing just fine. And it does lend itself to a flyer strategy, so you'll be looking for mass board pumps, you'll be looking for ways to pump a board of spirit tokens, and you're going to sit behind your death touch creatures and your small defensive creatures when it comes to playing against a big deck. So excited to play against Orzhov. It's got some combo potential, and I think it's going to play out well. Our last guild is Simic with Adapt, which is going to be our big creatures. We've already seen Gruul as the beatdown deck. Simic is going to be the beatdown deck. It's going to be huge creatures, but very mana intensive, and we'll talk about it when we get to that video. So, thank you for watching. My name's Timothy here with Mana Rocks. This was part 4. We'll be back with Simic for part 5 of our Ravnica Allegiance limited set review. Thanks for watching. I'll see you there.